Of course, we know that Francois Hollande is going to be meeting with Angela Merkel tomorrow, and already a lot of suspicions over the past week that they're not going to really agree on a lot of the terms that, of course, Sarkozy and Merkel had decided on previously, austerity versus growth. Give us an indication of whether you are confident that we could actually see synergies between Hollande and Merkel going forward.
Hollande was in effect elected in rejection of Sarkozy's policies, and in part elected because of a rejection of Sarkozy's negotiations with the German Prime Minister, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, with respect to the Euro bailout. And so therefore, in terms of policy, they have very little in common indeed. What now remains to be seen is whether or not individually they can establish a degree of chemistry. And if they can't, if they don't meet on policy, if they don't meet on chemistry, if they don't meet on the mutual need for stability in Europe, we could see the Eurozone being plunged into further crisis.
Okay, Tim, so if we could also just turn our attention now to the economic side of things. And here we are looking at the ECB, and we're really concerned as to whether the ECB is going to come in and start embarking on more stimulus to allay some of the fears. Do you think that we could actually see a fundamental shift to focus rather on growth? And as you mentioned, one of the biggest reasons that Nicolas Sarkozy was voted out was because of a lot of the austerity talk that had come to the fore. Do you think that we could actually see an overall change in sentiment in the Eurozone, one that shifts more to growth and does away with austerity?
I think that the political message that's being sent to the ECB, and it has to be sensitive to the politics of the Eurozone, ultimately to be part of the Eurozone or to be out of the Eurozone is as much a political decision as it is an economic decision. So those 12 countries made a political decision. If the politics of austerity are being rejected in Europe across the board, the ECB has to be sensitive to this. In other words, its policies have to be supportable amongst the countries of the Eurozone. Now, the election of Monsieur Hollande is a clear message that has been rejected. Austerity is being rejected. Some of the British by-elections are indicating austerity is being rejected. The Greek elections, austerity is being rejected. Yeah. And that means the ECB has to take note of this. And I think this could signal a shift from austerity to greater stimulus within the Eurozone itself.
Okay, Tim, you mentioned something interesting there when you said, the electorate basically saying that they're not, pro-austerity. But the truth is we're going to figure out who's really that powerful. And you're saying that the ECB will then have to take cognizance of what the people are voting in the Eurozone. But, you've got Germany, which is, the biggest, power in the Eurozone. And if they don't agree with that, we'll actually see who's really in charge, won't we? I mean, I mentioned the industrial production numbers that came through from Germany, and growth is coming through outside of the Eurozone. We're not seeing demand coming through from inside of the Eurozone. So if we start to actually seeing, the challenge of power and who really is in charge, then I'm sure that is going to be quite telling as to what the next step will be.
You're right. At the moment, the dominant figure in Europe is clearly Germany, and it is Angela Merkel, and she provides a degree of continuity. But she's running out of friends and allies in the Eurozone itself, and so she cannot run the Eurozone alone. And David Cameron has been sent a very clear message by the British electorate, and the French have issued their warning as well, as have the Italians, of course. The Spanish and the Portuguese are also in a degree of trouble, as of course are the Irish. And that means to say that perhaps we're now at the phase where the ECB has to fundamentally reconsider its role within the Eurozone. And you raise a really important point, and that is to say the intra-European trade as a percentage of, if you like, international trade is in fact diminishing. Certain European countries are finding much more rich pickings in the BRICS countries, for example. They're looking east, they're looking to Brazil, they're looking to Russia, India, and indeed Africa. And that could in effect have a change on the way the Eurozone is configured, the role of the ECB, and indeed the dominant position of Germany within the Eurozone. Yeah. What is absolutely fundamental, however, is that the Eurozone can only survive if Germany and France work together for its continuation. If there is no agreement, fundamental disagreement between France and Germany on the Eurozone, bailout packages, austerity, growth, the role of the ECB, we're into a much more fundamental crisis in Europe.
Okay, and Tim, and again, you know, we can have a socialist leader in every single country in the Eurozone, but if there's no money, there's no money. And we're worried about, you know, if we start to see any, you know, big movements coming through in Greece. And I'd like to use that as an example because we have the New Democracy Party together with PASOK, and those are the two dominant parties in Greece, both not even gaining 40% together as a whole, which means it's not even enough to create a government. We're starting to see a lot of socialist left parties starting to gain a lot of traction. But Greece doesn't have money to come out and say, well, I want to renegotiate these terms.
We're faced with a fundamental disjuncture. The politics is the politics of rejection of austerity, and if you like, a resurgence of the left. It's hard to see how the left will come up with a sort of financial stimulus when in fact all of those countries are deeply in debt. So we have a disjuncture between what the populace is saying at the polls, what they're saying ideologically, and what they're rejecting, and what any given country is able to deliver in terms of economic stimulus. And this is where I think the crisis may deepen in the Eurozone itself. What the people want and what countries can actually deliver out of central banks in particular, there is a yawning or a widening gap there. The question then comes as to whether or not China can be of some assistance in this, whether the United States can come to the assistance, whether the IMF has more bullets in its armory, whether the World Bank has a role. And we're now into this ironic situation and paradoxical situation, is that Europe may need to look to countries like China and the bank and the IMF for a solution to what is increasingly a fundamental political and economic challenge of survival.
Okay, Tim, so do you think that the EU is actually going to survive this?
We will know whether or not the EU, the Eurozone in particular, is going to survive this crisis probably within the next month or two, because if there is no agreement between France and Germany about the way forward, if you cannot cobble together a government in Greece, then the political crisis will deepen in the Eurozone. Britain already has its own political difficulties. There are a number of the PIGS countries in Europe are in severe both political, economic and financial crisis. And I think what the French election has done, it has heightened the sense of crisis within the Eurozone. The Greek election identifies it most crisply.